Flipping through the monster manual is a tried and true method for any new D&D player or dungeon master to waste a couple minutes looking at some cool drawings. But eventually, while you're peeping at all those pictures, you'll come to page 171, and as so many have done before you, you'll say, What? And it's because you found this guy and saw that for some reason, it was called a Gorgon. Now, I'm no Greek scholar, but I did read this book in middle school, so that's basically the same thing, right? And I'm pretty sure that a Gorgon is supposed to be a woman with snakes for hair who can turn you to stone just by making eye contact. In the original myth, there were three of them: Ctheno, Euryale, and of course, Medusa, who was defeated by Perseus when he cut her head off. Spoiler alert for like a super old myth. And also Percy Jackson. Meanwhile, this is a bowl made of metal that turns people to stone by breathing a green gas on them. Not quite the same, right? But according to the monster manual, this is a Gorgon, and this is a Medusa. Which is kinda like calling all goblins Jeffrey, because there was one really cool goblin that got murked by Gandalf or the Onceler. But back to the point, why is it that when everyone else says Gorgon, they're talking about a snake lady, except for Wizards of the Coast? And why has it been like this since the first edition of Dungeons & Dragons? Well, of course, the place to start is just some weird old dude. Edward Topsell lived from 1572 to 1625, and was an English author and member of the church. He had a pretty big interest in the natural world and zoology, and wrote several books on the topic. And boy, howdy was this guy credible. Here's a couple of the greatest hits of some of the real facts he included in his educational manuals. Elephants worship the sun and moon. Weasels give live birth through their ears. True toads, not those dirty fake ones, have a rock inside their head called a toadstone, and it'll protect you from poisons. Lemmings eat clouds. And those are just the facts about real animals that he wrote about. One of the books that he wrote was called The History of Four-Footed Beasts, in which he wrote of a strange Libyan beast that looked just a little something like this. He described it as a fearful and terrible beast to behold that looked something similar to a bull or an ox. He also said that it couldn't look up because its head was so heavy and its neck was so frail that it could barely lift it at all. Which is why this guy, Pliny the Elder of the Roman Empire, gave it the name Catoblepas, which came from the Greek word that meant to look downward. Topsell continues by saying these creatures had such horrible breath that anyone who got a whiff would be grievously afflicted thereby. Losing both voice and sight, they fell into lethal and deadly convulsions. And while the D&D Gorgon doesn't have a poisoning effect, it does exhale that noxious gas that turns you to stone. So that's sorta similar, but it's not quite right. Other key features that Topsell includes are extra thick eyebrows, dragon-like scales, and really long hair that only grows on their head. Long hair that he then compares to the fiction of the Gorgon sisters and the serpentine locks of Medusa. He then takes the opportunity to write a little fan fiction where he says Medusa was real, didn't have snakes on her head, but was the leader of a bunch of Amazonians living in Africa that Perseus fought against and defeated. And it just so happens that these creatures are native to the same part of Africa. At least according to some dude who I don't think ever actually left England. But now we understand Topsell's reason for calling this thing a Gorgon. Because they had long hair that reminded him of Medusa and they supposedly came from the same part of the world, he called them Gorgons. And then it's not that far of a leap to take the classical Gorgon's petrification ability and combine that with the stinking breath of Topsell's description. And doing that gets you pretty close to this Gorgon's stat block. But it's not that easy. Topsell goes on to question if the poison he claimed could cause someone to instantly die truly was related to their nasty breath. Rather, he goes on to suggest that it's more probable that he killeth by seeing, and in fact later doubles down, saying it is apparent that they kill with their eyes and not with their breath. Before giving us some anecdotes about people who died the instant they made eye contact with the creature. So basically, it had instant death vision. So I guess that's another point for connections between Topsell's Gorgon and the classical one, seeing as they both had vision-based powers, but without any poison breath, we're further from the D&D Gorgon. And weirdly, we're closer to another monster. Let's circle back to that Greek name, Catoblepas. If that name sounds vaguely familiar, you probably have a copy of Volo's Guide to Monsters, because on page 129 is this. The Catoblepas. And it's got a pretty interesting stat block. For one, it has a stench ability that can poison anyone within 10 feet if they fail a constitution saving throw. Not exactly the stink breath we heard about earlier, but it does achieve the same effect. It also has an action called Death Ray. Wonder what that does. If it can muster the strength to lift its head, it can target a creature within 30 feet that it can see. They then have to make a DC 13 constitution saving throw, and on a failure, they take 8d8 necrotic damage, or half as much on a success. And if they fail that save by more than 5, they just automatically take 64 damage instead. That's the same as rolling all 8s on those dice. And on top of all that, if you're dropped to 0 hit points, you instantly die. No death saving throws, just full on dead. But hey, at least it's not as mean as it was in first edition. Back then, if your party was surprised by this guy, it would look at one of your ventures and they would just be killed immediately. Without a con save, no matter how much HP they had, they were just gone. And there's a pretty decent chance it'll be able to do that again in a fight. And that all lines up really well with what Topsell wrote. He mentions their awful smell, struggle to lift their head, and eyes that can kill on a whim. And he even cites Pliny the Elder's original description when he indicates they have great teeth like swine, which I'll point out matches up perfectly with the D&D art for these guys. It was probably Pliny the Elder's writings who inspired much of what Topsell wrote, as in his works he also mentions the creature's very heavy head, which it carries with difficulty, saying that when it wasn't looking at the ground, it was deadly to the human race, as all who see its eyes expire immediately. And just so you know, nowadays we're pretty confident that the animal these two amateur zoologists were describing was just a wildebeest. They're shaped like a bull, have longish hair on their head, their neck and head are often to the ground as they graze on grass, and if you trust these guys, they can give you a literal death stare. So let's bring it all together then. The reason that in Dungeons & Dragons a Gorgon is a metal-plated bull with petrifying gas is because Pliny the Elder made up a bunch of facts about wildebeests, said that they had a heavy head, a weak neck, and death vision. This inspired Edward Topsell to make up some more facts, like giving it poison breath before walking that back, and adding draconic scales that maybe became metallic plating. And then he gave them a different name than what Pliny called them, based solely on a myth that is honestly fully unrelated, solely because they were from Africa and had long hair that reminded him of Medusa and the Gorgon sisters. And then when the original monster manual was being written, Pliny and Topsell's writings were inspiration for another creature that is fully unrelated to the D&D Gorgon, except for the fact that they're the same creature but different. And then the metal bull that was inspired by Topsell's writing was given the name Gorgon because that was the only other established title it had. And that left the D&D version of the Greek Gorgon with only the option of taking the name of its most well-known representative, Medusa. And the reason the D&D Gorgon exhales a petrifying gas is because Topsell's description included a part where it breathed poisonous vapor. And because he named it the Gorgon, or at least compared the two creatures in his writings, Gygax took their two abilities and mixed them together. Totally not complicated at all. Thanks for watching. Like, comment, subscribe, and follow me on Twitter at NotFromJupiter, and follow the channel on Twitter at DNDNoDice. Or you can watch these other videos. Is there anything else I'm supposed to say? I don't think so. Bye-bye!